Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lars Boering. I'm the director of the European Journalism Center Foundation. I'm happy to be here in Perugia, moderating a panel about data journalism. Data journalism is something that at the AJC we hold dearly. We have a wonderful platform called datajournalism.com, a great community with many journalists connected to it. We share with them information, we exchange information, but we also listen into one of the most knowledgeable journalists in data journalism. The reason why we have this panel is because recently we did a survey, and the State of Data Journalism Survey 2021. How do data journalists work? Who do they collaborate with? And what are the latest trends and thoughts about data journalism? What are the skills in the field that we are looking for? Some questions we asked and the answers we got. From identifying favorite data tools to sharing thoughts on the future of the field, this panel discussion will delve into the current state of data journalism. We have some fine guests with us. All the way at the end, Tara Kelly. I will introduce you shortly before you do your presentation. Brigitte Alfter, a senior German-Danish journalist, co-directing Arena for Journalism in Europe, having practiced journalism for more than a decade at local, national, and European level. And she realized the need for cross-border collaborative journalism structures. Delphine Reuter, next to me, part of the data and research team at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, ICIJ, collaborated with them since 2014, the LuxLeaks investigation, and joined full-time in 2019. Part of the data team, she produces research and analysis, involves structuring information in innovative ways, and she's a journalist, a teacher, and much more. And Clayton Aldern, senior data reporter at Grist, Reynolds Journalist Institute fellow. His writing and data visualization has appeared in The Atlantic, The Economist, The Guardian, and other publications. And he holds a master's in neuroscience and a master's in public policy for the University of Oxford. I'm already envious now. Studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and most recently was part of the team at Grist and the Texas Observer, which was supported by the Pulitzer Center and won an Online News Association Award in investigative data journalism. First, we will start with a presentation of the highlights of the Data Journalism Survey by Tara Kelly. She's the data editor for the European Journalism Center. She commissions and edits long-form articles for the AJC, and she's the host of Conversations with Data podcast. Previously, she worked as a journalist for the Huffington Post, Time Magazine, CNN International in London and New York, and most recently she earned a postgraduate degree in data journalism from the University College in Dublin. I feel very small when I sit next to giants like this. This survey would not have come about with the help of Simona Bisiani. She's also here. She's waving at us from the crowd. Incredible work done, getting things out there. If you want to work with her, find her. She will not disappoint you. I guarantee you that. Tara, let's give you the floor and give you some time to present the highlights.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lars. As Lars said, I'm Tara Kelly from datajournalism.com, and I'm going to be talking about the 2021 State of Data Journalism Survey that we conducted in November and December 2021. So we surveyed over 1,500 people involved in the data journalism world, and this was the biggest effort to date to measure the state of data journalism and looking at demographics, skills, tools, and also what the impact of the pandemic was on the field. But of course, this is not the first study of its kind. There were two other pieces of research conducted in 2017, and that was by Bahare Haravi and Mirko Lorenz, and also the Google News Lab. I should also mention that our project, datajournalism.com, is funded by Google News Initiative, like many projects here in Perugia. But yeah, so that study helped us come up with how we were going to go about what questions we were going to ask and what did we want to find out. So those were both really important pieces of research for us to move forward. So as I said, we got 1,594 people responded. We ended up using 1,285 of those in our analysis. As we all know, Sometimes data is, messy, not complete, so that's why we ended up using less. But this survey was available in Arabic, English, Italian, and Spanish because we wanted it to be global and representative of the state of data journalism around the world. So why now? Well, we felt because it had been a few years since the last study had happened, it was important for us to sort of take stock and benchmark what was happening. And as data journalism is becoming more of an important profession, particularly with the pandemic, we felt it was important to see what was happening now. And like I said, we targeted people in the field, actual students, but also professors, as well as practicing professionals, data journalists working with data, editors managing investigations, but also maybe working with data. We wanted everyone who was involved in this field and was or aspiring to be in it, but starting out. So that's just who we targeted. And we went about it by promoting across all of our EJC platforms, our datajournalism.com platforms, and asking everyone else to share it widely. And of course, we also offered a free trip to Perugia, so that maybe impacted the data slightly. And yeah, we do have someone who won from the Times of London. She's a data journalist, and she's here, I believe. And so yeah, let me just take you through the findings, though. So first, we'll look at some key demographics. Data journalism is still very much a male-dominated field. We've got 59% men, 39% women. This was also the first time we looked at non-binary, gender queer people to be a part of the survey. 1% identified as that. And what we were seeing is previously in other studies done by Bahare Harave, 57.5% were men, 42.5% were female. So we're seeing actually more men in the field now, slightly, and less women. When we looked at the data of the ages, we found that most people were between the ages of 25 and 44 in the field, and women tended to be younger. So they tended to be 25 to 34 years of age, and men were roughly 35 to 44. And non-binary were 35 to 44 years old. So that's just, but we also wanted to look at sort of where people, not where they were from, but where they were working. So we live in a global world. It's not really important where you're from. It's where are you based, where do you work at the moment? So we found out of the people who responded to the survey, 11% were in the US, 9% were in Italy, 7% in the UK, 6% in Spain, 4% in Germany, and then we had India, Nigeria, and Brazil. So, but out of the findings, like more of the detail around what's happening in the field, we found a quarter of respondents got into data journalism as a result of the pandemic. And I would say that's probably the most surprising finding. I mean, we all kind of knew that this was happening, but just to see that data and see this spurred probably journalists working with data before to go deeper. And one of the biggest challenges that data journalists have, according to the survey, was access to quality data. Also, time constraints, as we all know, anyone in a newsroom has faced that, lack of financial resources, and also lacking data analysis skills or the ability to really dig deep into the data. So as you can see, there's a long list here, and these results, I will share a link at the end so you can all dive in and see more detail. What are the things, what are the challenges that are hindering the field? But as we also found out, most data journalists are self-taught. So this is probably because a lot of universities are only starting to have dedicated data journalism courses or certificates or postgrads. And also because you can learn a lot of this on your own, and we do see a lot of interdisciplinary people coming from different backgrounds, scientists coming in, or people who are designers coming into the field. So we're seeing that, yeah, there needs to be more formal education perhaps based on these results when it comes to data journalism. And sometimes people are learning in the newsroom as well. What are the most popular programming languages? Python, CSS, HTML, and R were the top 3. That was followed by JavaScript, SQL, or SQL rather, and C, C++, and then some other ones that we asked. So yeah, I mean, journalists are learning to code. This is not a surprise, but those are the most popular. Excel is by far a favorite for data journalists. No surprises there. I mean, something like 3 out of 4 of the people we surveyed said they use Excel. 3 out of 5 say they use Google Sheets. And they also use data wrapper. So we were asking about data visualization tools, but also data analysis tools. So data wrapper, Flourish, Tableau, those were all in there, as well as Python. And not surprisingly, a lot of these people spend a lot of time number crunching. So they're analyzing the data, they're gathering the data, they're also cleaning the data and producing data visualizations and coding, designing web pages. So this is kind of how the breakdown, but analyzing data by far was the top thing that people spend most of their time on. When we asked people about salaries, because we really wanted to see how much are people making. Now, you have to remember this is global and people make different amounts of money globally, but the more skills you have, technically speaking, the higher your income. So some people, even 1% are making over $150,000, 4%, 100,000, between 50 and 100,000. Yeah, so it kind of, you could see the breakdown of how much people make, but it seems that data journalists are making more than regular journalists based on this skill set because they know how to code, because they know how to design, and they're used to working in that kind of environment. Data journalists also tend to work in small teams. So this is something that we discovered, and is no surprise. A lot of, the BBC will have a data team that's totally dedicated to data. And really the sweet spot is 2 to 5 people. But large teams are unusual. And we also asked about collaboration. And how many people, over a quarter of people said that they worked on a collaborative project in the last 12 months. And then we have 33% going solo and just working on their own. But people tended to say that they preferred working in a team because you could quality check each other's work. You guys had people had a mix of different skills, and that produced the best stories. And data journalism adds value for many different reasons. So we wanted to know why people, what is its value to you? And many said it meant that they could find interesting and more unique stories, important stories that were untold. It also enabled them to sort of democratize data, and also, given the amount of data that is being generated in this world, we need to have these skills to sort of continue and to delve in and tell these stories based on this data. And it also helps with impartiality, and data journalists also felt it really helped readers understand what they were reading about. So it provided context. If any of you want to check out the full results, which are very in-depth, and Simona Bassani did an amazing job with that, you could go to datajournalism.com/survey/2021 to find more. And if you're an academic, this is all open source. We want to share this. We want you to use it in your research, so please dive in. You can learn more, head over to datajournalism.com if you want to build your skills, and also subscribe to our newsletter, our podcast. Handbooks are also on there. But now I think we should hand it over to the experts. So back to you, Lars.
Yeah, thank you very much for sort of guiding us through this. So much data and so much information coming out of it, but some of the things that I pulled out of it is the question of how to obtain quality data. Brigitte, do you recognize that? We have to move the microphones a little bit, so if you... do you recognize that? Is that one of the things that you find challenging, to get good data sets?
Definitely, and sometimes you have to build your own data set. So I think we all are on the transition from the paper ages to the digital ages. And this goes for journalists, this goes for audiences, this goes for public administrations. And so getting access to data, usually I come from the paper ages. I was educated I went to journalism school in the 1990s. Back then we called data journalism computer-assisted reporting. Once we entered the 2000s, the younger colleagues would look at us and think, the grandparents are coming. But back then, access to data via freedom of information requests, for example, was unthinkable. And the authorities were really puzzled when we asked for data sets. Some of them would just give everything to us because they had no guidelines. And then now there are more established guidelines to public data. Another way of obtaining is to build your own database. And there we have luckily progressed so much that we can start including audiences in compiling empirical material that journalists then with editorial analysis can clean. So yeah, there's a big development and it's ongoing, and there's a lot of educational work both for ourselves in terms of journalism competences, data journalism competences, but also for authorities, communities to help contribute.
Yeah, your experience as a teacher and having been in the field for a long time, one of the other things that struck me, high skills, higher education, leading to higher pay, hopefully for everybody. Is that what journalism takes these days? More higher education, more knowledge about fields alongside journalism?
Well, yes, I part-time teach at a master course, master level, where we have investigative data and cross-border collaborative journalism, and there the data journalism is obligatory. Last year for the Data Harvest Investigative Journalism Conference, we collaborated with the Association of Journalism Teachers from across Europe. And a thing we discussed a lot in the preparation was math anxiety. And my take, based on my own experience, but also on the teaching, is that this is like an alphabetization process. In Gothenburg, data journalism is obligatory, both on the master investigative, but also on the Swedish basic education. And so they come in, and maybe they want to be on a screen on television, and maybe they want to write literary style. They get data journalism. Okay, we all know it's tough to learn these black things on white ground, and it says A and B and C. It takes time, right? It takes an effort to understand the basics. But if you know a bit of spreadsheet, a bit of Python, a bit of what is possible, then you can actually act as a data journalist. The other thing is the trend to collaborate with IT scientists, with really highly skilled data scientists. And then the competence is collaboration between journalism and data skills.
Yeah. Clayton Aldern, you come from a different side of it as a computer scientist and programmer before you became a data reporter. You moved into and you experienced that you meet journalists, maybe not journalists that are into data. What is there, the divide? Do you find a way to bridge this space and to find common ground and work together? How does that work?
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous question. Also, I appreciate you calling me a computer scientist. It's awfully generous. I'm not. The computational background is also self-taught, and I'm quite interested in this notion of the distribution of, when did you attain these skills? Were they self-taught? Was it professional? Was it some kind of educational background? And it seems quite telling to me that so many folks, perhaps on this panel, perhaps in this room, are indeed picking up these skills on the job. And so my answer to your question is I think it's a bit easier than it perhaps otherwise might be to bridge that gap, given the fact that there's so much in-office learning. Right? There's so much learning on the job that it's a little easier to, in my estimate, assemble some semblance of a shared experience, right? Data journalism is not just one thing, and certainly the skills that we saw on that screen, the size of the teams that we saw on the screen, right? Many of these teams are quite small. What does that imply? It implies that folks are learning a lot of different things, and perhaps they're forced to because there are very few other people who are wholly dedicated to data journalism in their newsrooms. And in my experience, other folks in the newsroom tend to recognize those constraints. They understand that data journalists who are working on teams of 1 or 2 or 3 are indeed perhaps doing double duty some of the time. And so I think that opens up the opportunity to, and maybe this is an optimistic view, but bridge a certain understanding gap that says, listen, we somehow ended up doing this work. Perhaps we did not go to school for it per se, but given the fact that we've found ourselves in this position now, why don't we try to work together and create the best experience for our audience as possible?
Do you ever experience, I would say, editors or other people that have a say in publications are sort of ambivalent about data journalism, or do you think it's become total part of what we do in journalism?
I've encountered a couple different camps of reactions to data journalism in the newsroom, and there's one camp that says, this is fabulous, let's invest heavily in data. It's the future. We're not going to be able to tell the stories at scale that we'd like to tell without core competencies on our team around things like scraping together big databases from the web or being able to model large data sets with machine learning. We're not going to be able to tell the stories we want without those competencies, so let's invest in data journalism. That's one camp. That's fabulous. I think there's another camp that says, well, you know, data journalism is one tool in the investigative reporting toolbox. Quantitative reporting should not necessarily trump the traditional tools of reporting. It's a complement. It's a useful set of techniques, and we ought to lean into it when we can. And personally, I find myself in this camp a lot of the time. Right? I don't think that quantitative or computational reporting ought to supersede traditional efforts insofar as you can learn a lot from a data set, and you can't learn those same things from talking to people or consulting an archive or conducting historical research or taking photographs on the ground, right? And so I think when data journalism is most effective is when it's met with an editor who sees it as a complement to this larger this larger effort of investigating. What does that mean for the bottom line? Are those newsrooms investing as heavily in data per se? That's kind of an open question in my estimate. Yeah. You know, certainly I have encountered editors who are skeptical, or at least skeptical of the potential of data journalism to establish causality investigations. That's where I find myself getting tripped up most in editorial relationships. I'll say something like, well, we could model that, and the editor will say, but you won't be able to prove that it's true. And I can lean on a statistical background and say, okay, right, causation, not correlation, et cetera, or correlation, not causation, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, this is much more subtle than that. This multivariate model is very well controlled, and I think if we do it well, beyond reasonable doubt, we can make a very compelling claim that gets us quite close to causality. But that little, you know, that soundbite doesn't always translate. And so I do think that there's a challenge that occurs sometime in which there's this mismatch in understanding between an editor and a data journalist about what it is that the data journalist is trying to accomplish in a given role.
Can you mention one story that is a great example of where it worked almost perfectly?
I'm speaking on another panel tomorrow about a story that comes to mind, and maybe it's fresh in mind because of that reason. But you know, this is an example of a story in which we have a national nonprofit publication partnering with a local publication dedicated to the Texas and New Mexico region. Support came in from the Pulitzer Center. There's a good group of folks working on the ground insofar as we have reporters who are visiting ranches. This is a story about abandoned oil wells and gas wells in Texas and New Mexico. There are reporters on the ground visiting these ranches. There are investigative journalists filing records requests and conducting huge archival searches. There are data journalists working on the team, scraping down large data sets and assembling databases based on those public records requests and building a statistical model of this phenomenon of abandonment of these oil wells. And right there are these moving pieces that work quite well together, given the fact that I think we're taking advantage of the multiple competencies in all of these organizations and on these teams, right? You call in a drone photographer and you have some compelling imagery. You have some really talented editors who know how to work with each of those varying components. And you know, I think the result is a sense of mutual respect, a compelling product, and I think importantly a story that works at the local level and at the national level. And that can be so hard to do in these collaborations between national outlets and local outlets. And I think one of the benefits of this approach that we took was the local story came through by nature of the fact that reporters were indeed on the ground reporting on their own communities, and national data journalists were able to take a somewhat more top-down approach and offer additional statistical context, again, not to supersede those efforts, but again, to elevate them to a slightly different realm.
Yeah. While I ask you to move the microphone to Delphine. Delphine, you've done some incredible award-winning investigations with ICIJ, sorry for that, as a researcher and as a data journalist. What are the data skills you think are impossible to live without having done many of these research?
Okay, so I have to explain a little bit what ICIJ is, because it's a very UFO type organization. I think more and more we see the same type of organization being born around the world, and there's lots of networks, but it is the only one that is so international. So it's both a newsroom and a network of investigative journalists. So we work with, as a data reporter, I'm on the data and research team. We also have a tech team, which also has data journalists on there. We have reporters who do have some experience with data, or who think they do, and then there's a misunderstanding. We have some discussions about that. But we do have to both be a support for our own reporters in our team, and then support the work that our media partners across the world do. So when we approach data, we have to see not only what is important internally for ICIJ as a newsroom, and also on the long term, because we have those projects that last a year or more sometimes, so you just have to be able to plan ahead. And then you have to also listen and see if the approach that you have at a certain point in time is still the right one a few months later. So it's not for us. We do use Excel, we do use Google Sheets, we do use Python, but then it's like you have to also have the ability to be flexible, plan ahead, communicate well across borders, across time zones, listen to your partners, because they have so many different needs in different regions of the world. So all of that is actually part of the work that we do. Not each of us at the same time, of course, but it's like you have to be able to take on different roles across the lifetime of a project. So I think depending on the size of the team that you are on, I hope you work in a team as a data journalist. Just from my own perspective, I think that I'm learning so much more when I'm on a team of different people, because first you learn from your own mistakes, you learn from others' mistakes, and this is also part of the skills you should have. This is not just technical skills, but it's like being able to know that you have your own limitations and that you're always learning, that you should always be open to discuss the process that you have, whether it's a good one or you have to adapt during the lifetime of a project as well. So it's a lot of different things for me. It's not, in schools, I guess we tend to focus on the technical aspects, but as you learn on the job, there's so many other things that you have to integrate within your work. And I still cannot believe sometimes when I look at a spreadsheet that I've made, because sometimes, often we actually have to build our own spreadsheets because they don't exist. We have to collect data from different sources. We join databases, and then we come up with an analysis. And as careful as you are with the data and with your own processes, you still make mistakes. And you have to so be careful about what you do. It's always like, don't be too, I've done this before, I know this type of data, I know the source of the data. The data might have changed in the meantime. So you always have to be super, what's the word? Critical. That's the word I'm looking for.
Rigorous.
So and rigorous. Rigorous we always are. We tend to be super detail-oriented, sometimes a little too perfectionist, if you ask the reporters. We do spend a lot of time on fact-checking. And I'm super careful with what I say. I always talk about the limitations of the analysis, but then the reporters are like, okay, what can I say? And I'm like, yes, first, you should know what you cannot say. It's like, no, but like, I'm writing a story, so it's part of my process. But yeah, and being able to also educate people, it's so important because sometimes the reporters come to the data reporters or the data journalists and they ask, can you do this for me? I have this question for you. Can you find this data? Like, it would be so much more interesting as a data journalist if you're part of the whole process. Like, I want to think about this story with you. What do you want to say? Then it can be much more creative and we can work together with the editors, the editor of the story and the editor of the data project together, because we have our own perspective and the story is much better from that. So it's all these skills, communication and being able to talk about the work that you do and how it can be used by reporters. It's all part of it.
Yeah. Can you also share with us a story where you worked and the data came in and you had this absolute wow moment that it turned out to be completely different than you had assumed in the beginning?
Oh, let me think. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good example, but it's just an example that I hold really dear because it was such a great experience. We worked on this big project called Pandora Papers, and as part of it, one of the reporters, it's about offshore and the offshore industry and offshore companies. And there was this rich guy who had 2 trusts in Jersey, and the data was very limited in the leak that we got. We just knew that there were these BVI companies held by Jersey trusts and some assets. But then this person had been indicted in the US because he had been looting those beautiful Khmer sculptures from Cambodia, and he had sold them to museums. And the reporter's question was just like, okay, can I track those statues across the world? Can we do it? I don't know, I have to say. As a data journalist, sometimes you don't have the answer. You're like, okay, give me 2 hours, give me 2 days. Just let me do the research, and then I can come back to you with an answer. I think journalists should also learn that data journalists don't have all the answers, like this. You have to do some research sometimes. And, sometimes, all the time. And we ended up using so many different sources. We used museums' websites, we used catalogs, we had to go to libraries, and we came up with this huge spreadsheet that the reporters found overwhelming because I was tracking everything. I was tracking the size of the statue, I was tracking its weight, because I wanted to, if you track something across borders and across time, you have to be able to compare a lot of data. So you have to track everything to make sure it's the same pieces. But I remember the reporters just being very frustrated with my spreadsheet. They were like, there's so much stuff in there. Where is the information? And I was like, the information is everywhere. Like, just ask me a question, and then I will classify the data, and then I will give you the number. But so it became part of this reporting too. I still, this is a spreadsheet that changed over time, because as we were doing the research, they had more and more questions. Can we say how many Khmer sculptures we had? Okay, then I have to add a column that says Khmer or not. And then I have to do research on what that means and where the statue comes from. And sometimes I have a maybe. And we're like, okay, maybe, what does that mean? So it was this constant process, and it was not perfect. But what was super interesting is that a reporter came with a question. They thought the answer would be somewhat easy. It wasn't. But then we all of us learned from this process. And I know that the spreadsheet was still awful. It's not my best work, but it was part of the whole reporting process. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's a very nice one. I'm fascinated. I see in front of me these data sets and also this sighing and like, where do we go from here? Why did we ask this question in the begin with? And that's why I like you gave a great answer to my question. Brigitte, you see in this report coming a lot of information coming about the different skills, collaboration. You are into cross-border investigative journalism a lot. Do you recognize in the results the skills, the data skills that people need to know to do this right?
Yes, and I see a sort of a variety of levels of skills that are necessary. I think the most important is the entrance, to just invest the time of learning the A, B, and C of data journalism, because once you know what's possible, then you can take it from there. I can't code, but still, I can do data journalism because I know what's possible. I keep myself updated with what's technically possible. And then I am pretty good at collaborating. So collaboration between journalists and data scientists or people with data skills at whichever level. Some are self-taught, some come from the universities. The collaboration between a journalist and someone who has the data competences the journalist needs to know what's possible and needs to be able to communicate with the person with the data skills. And we see some really interesting examples. So we do see journalists, of course, who learn to code and learn to code more, and then they get going. But we also see these beautiful collaborations. We see people in highly estimated data journalism newsroom who invest, like in Germany, there was a lady who went 1 year to Nijmegen just to figure out how journalists and people with data skills could collaborate in a newsroom. I'm on the jury of the Norwegian Data Scoop Journalism Award, and I read the methodology reports that they're required to submit, and luckily they put a limit of 20 pages to the methodology report, because otherwise we would go mad. But it is a fantastic insight into how they work. And so we see, particularly, I think, and you may know more, but I think particularly in wealthy countries, large newsrooms, they invest in data scientists who are then socialized into the newsroom. So one of my favorite examples is from Norway, where a data scientist was employed. A young gentleman came into the newsroom and was sort of teamed up with a twin journalist, and they looked into pedophile websites, sharing pedophile material. And the journalist, who was mid-career, highly estimated, known for his integrity, known for his good interview skills. That's what I knew from him. And so these two together sat down and made a set of ethical rules on how to deal with that. They did not want to hack any websites, but they did consider their role as entering these networks. And what would they do there? How would they act there? How would they deal with sources? And so they unveiled this entire entire network of people sharing pedophile material globally. It was a long adventure over several years. They published along the way. And what I found really moving was when then they published, they found among those many people Norwegian users of the website and approached some of them for interviews. And that's when the journalist stepped in, this experienced journalist with a good interview technique, talking with these very difficult sources. And afterwards, and that's in the methodology report, one of the sources said, "I'm grateful because it was like an addiction. I now get a punishment, I get a court case, but you helped me get out of this addiction." And that was data journalism. I would classify that clearly as data journalism, because without the data scientists, it wouldn't have been possible. But where is the limit between, learning your Excel ABC and knowing what's possible, and then doing a story like that where you need a data scientist to actually make it happen?
Yeah. We see that a lot of journalists are self-taught, at least that's what the survey gives us. At the same time, we see a very high level of education. Clayton, do you encounter that also in the field? If you work together, is this actually a wonderful combination? Self-taught, high education, different approaches, or does that make it more difficult?
Well, I think it in part depends on the type of newsroom in which you find yourself. Right? Again, I think some editors and organizational leadership structures are more amenable to allowing folks to learn on the job versus hiring for something very specific. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it's the difference between a large legacy newsroom and an organization like that where I work, for example, which is not small. Grist is about 60 people. Our newsroom is maybe 25, but I think there are something on the order of let's call it 2 of us who do quote-unquote data journalism full-time. And so the implication is that the folks on that two-person team are necessarily engaged in different types of work. They don't need to specialize, and in fact, they can't by nature of the fact that the team is small. And so, you know, what is the relationship between these kind of large, manifold skill sets and something like education per se? I think it pivots entirely on the type of organizational environment in which you find yourself. And I think the luckiest of us are those who are able to take online classes on the job or spend a couple hours a week just browsing Stack Exchange for some code, or, you know, walking through somebody else's story on GitHub. How did they do this? Okay, great, I'm just going to read their code. If you have an editor who's supportive of that kind of, let's call it upskilling, then I think your data team is going to thrive beautifully, even if it's quite small. But sometimes there's not necessarily, you know, interest or capacity at some larger newsrooms, which is this kind of strange perverse incentive, right? If you hire for somebody who only does statistical reporting, you kind of assume that they know how to do that thing. And you wouldn't presume that they also know how to build some kind of interactive data visualization in D3 or something like that. And so, you know, you're not going to give them time on the job to learn how to do that because there's somebody else on your team who already knows how. So in that sense, I'm quite a fan of the small newsroom, you know, the scrappy approach, because I think it affords a lot more of this learning on the job.
Do you see any examples of media organizations that assemble big data teams and put a lot of effort into it and a lot of resources?
I think the LA Times is a sterling example. And I think in particular what compels me about their model is that a couple years ago they said, the data desk at the LA Times is no longer a service desk, right? We are our own team. Delphine, I think you'd mentioned earlier this notion that a reporter often comes to a data journalist and says, okay, I'd like something from you, whether it's a chart or a data set or an analysis of a data set. It's effectively implying that the data desk operates as an in-house consultancy and you know, responds to reporters' requests outside of the scope of the story writ large, and you know, it can be a little dangerous because perhaps they don't have all the context of the story, but they go off and they create their data set or they create their chart and they send it back and then they never hear another word. And a couple of years ago, the LA Times said, we're not going to do that anymore. We are our own investigative reporting unit. We will still create graphics for the rest of the newsroom, but here's kind of what that structure looks like. Let's put a process in place for ensuring that folks get the graphics they need and the data sets they need. And also we can recognize that it is within scope of a data reporting team to be conducting original research and publishing on those results. And so I appreciate the delineation of those roles and the processes that the LA Times has put in place to ensure that we're getting the what I would argue is the right work out of the folks who are on those teams.
Delphine, I saw you smile when you said the data the team is now telling we're not. The last days I heard about how reporters used to call their this is my photographer. Do you encounter still this is my data journalist, and how do you better? I mean, it's also a question for me to think about. You know, you have to build an investigative team, and I don't think it goes well that if you would say this is my person for this or that, you have to assemble the team for that.
I mean, it depends. I think. Sorry.
That's okay.
I think different investigative projects call for different approaches or different small projects within a big one. So depending on the needs of the story, you might be assembling different people. I do like pairing as well. So if a reporter has a specific needs and I know that I have the skills or I might have them or I might acquire them, then it's actually very rewarding to work on a team of two for a while. I might not be there for the whole process, and then the editing process at ICIJ is very heavy. So actually, if I don't have to be through the whole editing process, I don't mind, because the stories you write are very long, and sometimes the data doesn't have to be, you know, on every page of the story, so to speak, because we're an online newsroom. But yeah, I was smiling because I have a colleague, he's in Albuquerque, so I tend to work with him maybe 4 hours a day because he's so far away from me. Or I'm far away from him, depending on how you look at it. But he tends to say, I don't want to be a short order chef. And I love that formula because it's like, I'm not there waiting for somebody to choose something from a menu and me to give it to them. I'm there to be part of the whole discussion. Like, I want to know what are the questions you have, who are you talking, I mean, maybe not in all details, but like who you think you can talk to, because data can come in so many very different shapes and forms. It's not just a data set somewhere, it's so many other things. And then you can actually, I mean, we're all journalists on the team, so we have this journalism mindset, and then we acquire those data skills. And I think that's what, sometimes it can come with a little frustration when the reporter comes to you, and because they are the reporter, they tend to think that they're the one reporting the story, and that's fine. But then you're like, I can do so much more for this story, and I know I can. But then if you don't talk to me, also because we're in different time zones, you know, of course, I don't know where the story is going anymore. And a story can change in so many ways. Yes, I'm still going to write about whatever trusts in this state, but I have taken the story in this other direction because I met this and this difficulty. But the data you provided like 2 months ago might not be interesting anymore. It might be updated, there might be another source, you might come at it from a different perspective. And data is old the second it's published, the second you gather it, it's already old, so you have to like be part of something to make sure that the research that you provide, the support that you provide, you have a real collaboration for it to really work out. And it can be a source of great frustration. That's why I was smiling, because I know I've been there, I will be there again. And it's also why you have to have those communication skills, because you have to be able to say, not just this is a problem, but okay, this has been happening in the past, I think that's how we can fix it. And these are the ways I think we can go forward together in the future. Like, you have to be able to do all this work on your own, I mean, as a data journalist, to make the data journalism better, you know, in the whole team. Yeah. So, yeah.
There's a question from the audience, so please, I will repeat your question, just... Yeah, how can you approach your editor when you're in a situation that the editor already has the story almost in mind and is maybe looking for data to back it up? Is that, yeah, that's the correct. Clayton is raising his hand, so
I have a very short answer, I think, which is only to suggest that tends not to constitute data journalism, right? It's not the scientific method. I think data journalism is quite akin to science, and coming in with a foregone conclusion fails to reach that standard. I've written a little bit for The Economist, and when you pitch their data team, you pitch them a question. And the question is an empirical one that you can test. And the best questions, in fact, the only pitches they accept, are those for which you can write a headline if the answer is yes, and you can write a headline if the answer is no. And so I would argue that a great way to start a conversation with an editor like that is to say, well, listen, let's be clear on what the question is here, and find the one that is publishable, find the one for which the answer is publishable, regardless of what it is, right? And I think there are so many great stories out there for which that is true, that conducting the work, conducting the research, and publishing the results is worthwhile, regardless of what the finding might be per se.
Thank you. You just spoke about making it a better a place, data journalism, improving it constantly. Delphine, how problematic is it? Well, let me rephrase. It is problematic that this is male-dominated, this working field. I mean, this survey shows it. My question first is, do you recognize that in your work? And the second one is, what should we do to change that?
I think I have I mean, it's something that's very close to me because I'm at that age where everybody's getting babies and I'm not. So it's a question, as a woman, when you work in journalism in general, whether you're a data journalist or not, if you at some point have to step into the shoes of a managerial role, which I think is part of the reason, but I'm just interpreting the results, but it's part of the reason why there might be less women. At some point in your career, you just have to make some choices, and I think that data journalism can be very demanding. And I mean, we see more and more young women and young girls learning the skills they need to do data journalism early, not needing to have someone at school, having to wait for someone at school to actually take you to a computer. You can do that online anytime. If you are somebody who is a bit tech savvy and you're interested in coding in general and journalism and telling stories, I mean, data journalism will come naturally to you. But I think it's something happens in all our careers where you just have to make choices. And I think that some women might be less inclined to spend the time for data journalism sometimes. But in our team, I have to say we are a female-dominated team, if that's such a thing. So my data editor is a woman, and I think we are 4 women on the team, and there's just one guy in Albuquerque. And then, of course, we work with a developer as well, who's a man. But our gender imbalance, so to speak, is in the other direction.
Okay. Do you recognize this, Brigitte? This do you encounter imbalance, or is the survey? Is our data set wrong?
At the University of Ghent, there was a PhD written about women in data journalism a couple of years ago, which indicated indeed that were more men than women. Interestingly, and I must admit I don't remember whether her scope was global or European. But interestingly, at the data harvest that we organize, we don't have any problems of bringing in female data journalists or data editors, or at some point, so over time, more and more newsrooms said, okay, we'll have a data desk or a data editor. And some of them were feeling like, they were asked, can you set up my printer network? And they were like, no. And so as we saw, they experienced the same in France and in Sweden and here and there. We put them on a panel, which is what you do on a European conference. And there were women, and there were 4 girls and 1 boy or something like that. So we didn't think about the gender. We thought about the question of having a data editor in newsroom experience a certain time of problems. We put them on a panel, and we saw more women than men. So in recent years, we've been paying more attention of trying to really make sure that there is a balance. But sometimes we have to think of the balance in terms of bringing more boys than girls, because the initial move would be more women than men. And so I don't see it very clearly, but this PhD, which had a larger data set, I assume, indicated there were more men and women. And then also we'll have to look at the level of payment that you indicated in the report, and that is, of course, super interesting. I was on at the same table here yesterday talking about female founders in journalism initiatives, and one of the hypotheses why there were quite a few female founders is that it's insecure, the pay is potentially a lot of Conamora work, and if the tradition is that the male would supply the family, then women can afford to do these kind of jobs, or they're used to lower pay. So this question is, I think, really interesting, like matching the gender and the pay question. Yeah. So not only the overall figure, but diving deeper into it. I think I would be really curious to hear more about that. Maybe you have some?
Yeah, well, I think that's something Simona can, we can dig through the data and see what that is, can't we, Simona?
Yeah, probably.
And explore further, because I don't have it off the top of my head. But no, I mean, there's still almost 4 out of 10 people in data journalism are women. It's not bad. And also, I still need to, we need men too. We need a mix. In order for that to happen, the studies have shown around gender and what happens, you need the men and the women to mix together. You can't just have, I mean, it's great to have all women, but you in order to get the most out of that, that's what you need. So I think that there's something to be said. Okay. And we can learn from our male colleagues as well. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just throwing that out there to be cheeky.
You have to wait with hiring Simona because she's now assigned to figuring out this in the data set.
Yeah.
I saw a hand raised. I see 2 hand raised. I will start with you and then...
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Do you know what the gender division is in general in journalism? So is it still male-dominated or...?
Yeah. It is, yeah. I mean, I don't have the exact data off the top of my head, but yeah, it is very much so. That's why I'm saying this is quite high, 4 out of 10. Yeah. I think it's more like 2 out of 10 or 3 out of 10, because as women have children and they have other responsibilities, we're seeing that they're moving out of the field. And just like we're seeing, there's a lot of young women coming into this field. Who knows, maybe they'll stay. But yeah, it seems that is, and who knows, maybe the pandemic is going to change that. There are more journalists who are working with data who are now coming into data journalism, as I said before. And the audience, there's more of an audience now that is data literate because of the pandemic, or at least that's what people are finding. Audiences are more open to this kind of information and want more of those stories.
Yeah. I saw you were first. Yes, thank you. So let me try to rephrase the question. Yeah, that's a difficult one to rephrase. I think you got the question most right, Brigitte. The question was whether also during the pandemic is it Ah, yeah. Yeah. Is the audience more receptive for male data journalists? That's a difficult one to answer, I think. Yeah.
I don't know if we have the data. I don't think we have the data on that.
We don't have that. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I'm not so sure. I mean, I guess for somewhere like The Economist where you don't have a byline, I don't know. I can't really answer, but it's something that we should look at maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I have time for 2 more questions. I saw 2 hands up front. I'd like you to go first, sir.
I think it's just, I actually don't want to see data journalism just as that. That's the whole thing. Because we know from experience that the whole field of journalism has been white male dominated for so many years. And we know that therefore a lot of the coverage is biased. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, but when you consider everything else that we could do, then you're like, okay, we're being very exclusionary of a lot of other realities that are just not represented. It's just a question of representation. So of course, when you assign something, like a specific data set, and then the process is the same, scientifically you should reach the same conclusion. But the data might be biased, so that's the problem. Then the way you approach the information should be seen from so many different perspectives. And I still struggle with the fact that ICIJ is a very white organization, and we have a lot of males in managerial role for different reasons. And I think it's important we work on that too, and we recognize that it might be an issue, and especially when you have interns or fellows who have so much to bring in, and they lack sometimes the confidence to voice their concerns, also because they don't see themselves represented in the newsroom, and they have all these, personal experience of like, am I going to be taken seriously? And all these questions that people might have in their own head for different reasons prevent, in the end, the stories and the data to be sent to the audience. So it's like this constant, it's a huge issue, of course, when you look at something specific, we might come to the same conclusion, but like, you have to look at this from this, what's the term?
Bigger perspective, yeah.
I'm
Full,
struggling for the word,
360.
Can I just add a short?
You can add a short, and then I have one question, and then we have to round up, otherwise we get told off.
Just a quick clarification. When I suggested earlier that data journalism can reflect the scientific method, that is not to suggest that it is an objective practice, right? The interpretation of data and the analyses thereof is entirely subjective. And I think one of the greatest mistakes we make as journalists and data journalists is to somehow presume that quantitative reporting is de facto more objective than other forms of reporting. So if you accept that claim that it's also a subjective act, then that's also to accept the claim that it is imbued with folks' experiences. And so I think the answer is no. Many people have different interpretations of data sets.
Brigitte?
You framed before this the art of the question. So you said, if you work with an editor, talk about questions. I think our individual background, be that gender, color, national background, upbringing, social group, all this affects how we ask questions. And I think this is the important, the art of the question. And yes, we can learn to empathize with other groups. Okay, I'm white, I have this education, I have this position, I can try to empathize, to ask the right questions that don't concern me, white, middle class, whatever. But we will ask different questions, so we have to focus on the art of the question, and then we enter the data field.
The art of the question, you had a question, hopefully a short question that we can short on. Yeah, what's the influence of background and coming into journalism? Maybe Tara, can I? No, you guys go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead, okay. Brigitte, you want to answer that one?
Coming into journalism is, here again, we talk about representation. It's super important to pay attention to that. Journalism schools have a role, but also once we end the journalism school, we have to think about how to make the transition. When you teach the last half year before the students leave journalism school and go out into whatever reality, they are like this until you get them into a job or an internship. And some of these internships cannot be afforded by people in certain social classes because they can't afford it. They don't have a parent to pay the last little bit of the rent. They don't have, so these kind of programs are one thing, and we've seen some excellent programs in the UK, for example, where because some people simply don't see themselves in that role because they've never seen a role model from some social groups. And when you then follow their path, you see how rich the reporting gets. So yes, making an effort to bring all sorts of people into journalism.
Yeah, lots of topics to talk about, to ponder, but we are at the end of our panel. Tara, Brigitte, Clayton, Delphine, and the team of datajournalism.com. Follow us and be connected to it and enjoy this festival in Perugia. Thank you very much.